I am 31M. For the first time in over a decade, my family was finally having a full-scale reunion. My parents, uncles, aunts, cousins, people I hadn't seen in years, were all coming together for a long weekend at my grandparents' lake house. I was actually looking forward to it. The lake house wasn't just some vacation spot. It was the core of my childhood. Summers spent fishing with my grandpa, late nights roasting marshmallows, running through the woods with my cousins. It was the closest thing to a real home I ever had outside of my own. My grandfather had built it with his own hands, and when he passed, the house went to my dad and my uncle. As far as I knew, it was always meant to stay in the family. And since I was the only one who still visited regularly, I had assumed one day it would be mine. I was wrong. From the moment I arrived, something felt off. My uncle's side of the family, his wife, my cousin Brian, 33M, and a few others, were acting different. Normally, they barely acknowledged the lake house. Brian almost never visited, and when he did, he spent the whole time complaining about how outdated it was. Now suddenly, they were acting like they had a personal connection to it. Brian was the worst, walking around like he owned the place, making comments about future renovations, talking about how some things need to change around here. I ignored it at first, chalking it up to his usual arrogance. But then I started noticing the weird little things. Brian and my uncle whispering in the kitchen late at night, mentioning lawyers. My aunt asking my dad weirdly specific questions about property taxes. Little comments that didn't seem important on their own, but added up to something that wasn't sitting right. Then I overheard the conversation that confirmed everything. I had gotten up late at night to grab a drink from the kitchen when I heard my uncle and Brian talking in hushed voices. I stopped before they could see me, listening from the hallway. "We need to finalize it before the weekend ends," my uncle said. "Once it's in my name, we'll be ready to list it." "List it? As in, sell it?" Brian laughed. "Dad, I told you. We should have done this years ago. No one's gonna fight us on it." My stomach dropped. The next morning, my uncle called for a family meeting. Everyone gathered in the living room, expecting some big announcement. My uncle stood up, clearing his throat like he was about to make some sentimental speech. "I just wanted to let everyone know," he said, "that the lake house is now officially in my name." He glossed over the details, but later I found out how he pulled it off. He had filed a fraudulent power of attorney document, forging my dad's signature with the help of a shady notary willing to look the other way. It's a big responsibility, but I think it's for the best. Dead silence. My dad looked blindsided. He turned to my uncle completely confused. "What do you mean it's in your name?" My uncle gave some half-hearted explanation about how he had taken care of the legal side to make sure the house was in good hands. My dad was still staring at him in shock. "That's not what Dad wanted," my dad said. "We were supposed to share it." My uncle shrugged. "Things change. It's too late to contest anything now." That was when Brian decided to open his mouth. "Honestly, it's for the best," he said, smirking. "This place needs some serious upgrades. I already have some ideas. Probably tear down the old shack and build something new. I don't think I've ever wanted to punch someone more in my life." I demanded to see the paperwork. My uncle, still acting like nothing was wrong, pulled out a folder and handed it to me like I was just being dramatic. I skimmed through it, my heart pounding. It was all there. Legal documents, transfer agreements. But then something caught my eye. My dad's name was missing from the approval line. My dad was supposed to co-own this house. He never signed off on this. I looked up. "You forged this." My uncle didn't even flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about." Brian laughed. "Man, you're really taking this hard." My dad was still frozen in shock, whispering to himself, "I don't understand," like he was trying to piece everything together. He looked completely defeated. "We can't afford a legal battle," he muttered under his breath. "Maybe we should just let it go." Let it go? Absolutely not. I went back to my room and started digging through my things. I had brought an old binder full of documents my grandfather had left behind. Letters, notes, things he had written about the house over the years. I flipped through it until I found what I was looking for. An old letter from my grandfather written years ago. It wasn't a legal document, but it was clear as day. This house is meant to stay in the family. It is not to be sold outside of blood relations, and no changes should be made without mutual agreement. I clenched the paper in my hand. This wasn't over. I went back out and started asking questions. Who knew about this? Who was in on it? Some of my extended family looked away awkwardly. My uncle's wife suddenly didn't want to get involved. Some cousins just shrugged, saying it's not worth the fight. Fine. If no one else was going to fight, I would. I called a friend of mine, a lawyer, and told him everything. He asked for copies of the deed, the transfer papers, anything I could get my hands on. He also gave me one critical piece of advice: get a copy of the new deed, immediately, which meant one thing: I needed to get my hands on those documents before my uncle had a chance to cover his tracks. And I already had a plan. The house was silent that night. Most of the family had gone to bed early after the so-called family meeting. I stayed in my room, listening, waiting. I knew where my uncle kept the documents. He had brought a locked briefcase with him, setting it up in the study like it was no big deal. But I had noticed something earlier. He wasn't as careful as he thought. The lock was old and he had left the key sitting in a drawer when he wasn't paying attention. I waited until the house was completely still. Then I made my move. The study was on the other side of the house, down a long hallway where the floorboards creaked if you stepped in the wrong spot. I moved carefully, slow enough not to make noise. My uncle and his family were staying in the guest rooms downstairs, and if I got caught, there'd be no talking my way out of it. I opened the drawer, grabbed the key, and popped open the briefcase. Stacks of papers. Some looked old, some freshly printed. I flipped through them quickly, snapping photos with my phone. Mortgage documents, property transfer papers, legal agreements. Then I saw what I was looking for. The new deed. My dad's name was missing. I snapped more photos, making sure I had everything. As I was about to close the case, I saw something else. A letter from a lawyer. The date was recent. It was a confirmation of ownership transfer, stating my uncle was now the sole owner. Except there was one huge problem. The document clearly stated that both original owners needed to sign off for the transfer to be valid, and my dad never signed. I locked everything back up and slipped out of the study, phone in hand. The next morning, I didn't wait. I called my lawyer friend and sent him everything. He called back almost immediately. There's a major problem with their paperwork, he said. Your dad never signed off on the transfer. That means your uncle's claim on the house isn't legally binding. That was all I needed to hear. At breakfast, I walked into the kitchen, where most of the family was gathered. My uncle was drinking his coffee like he didn't just pull the rug out from under everyone. Brian was leaning back in his chair, looking way too comfortable. I laid my phone on the table. You don't own the house. The room went quiet. I pulled up the photos. This transfer isn't legal. My dad never signed off on it. Which means, as of right now, your claim to the house is worthless. My uncle didn't react at first. Then he laughed. We already went through the legal channels, he said, waving a hand like I was being ridiculous. You're just upset you lost. Brian leaned forward, smirking. What are you gonna do? Sue us. Good luck with that. I didn't say anything. I just kept looking at my uncle. He stopped smiling. Then I told him I had already spoken to a lawyer. Now the whole room was dead silent. I watched as my uncle's face twitched, like he was trying to decide whether to double down or backtrack. He chose wrong. This is a family matter, he said. We don't need courts involved. I didn't respond. My dad, still hesitant, shook his head. We don't need to start a legal battle over this, he said, quietly. That's when my grandmother, who had been silent through all of this, finally spoke up. She looked directly at my uncle and said, your father never wanted this house sold. You know that. Now the room wasn't just quiet, it was tense. A few cousins started whispering. My aunt looked uncomfortable. Some relatives were clearly siding with my uncle. Others were looking at me like maybe I wasn't crazy after all. Brian, who had been smug this whole time, suddenly wasn't making eye contact. I looked at my uncle. Fix it. Put the house back in both names, or I file a lawsuit. He sat back, shaking his head. You don't have proof that Dad didn't want this. I pulled out my grandfather's letter, the one I found last night. The one where he explicitly said the house was meant to stay in the family and should never be sold. Brian's eyes darted to the paper. Then, before anyone could react, he grabbed it. He crumpled it in his hand like that would make it disappear. I lunged forward, snatching it back before he could do anything else. The room erupted. Family members started yelling over each other. My uncle stood up, telling everyone they didn't need this drama. Brian was practically dragging his parents out the door. Within minutes, they were packing up, cutting their trip short. They left before lunch. That same afternoon, I made the hardest decision of my life. I filed the lawsuit. Filing the lawsuit should have been the end of it. I expected resistance, maybe even a few desperate attempts to settle, but I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. A week after the reunion, I came home from work to find my apartment completely trashed. The front door wasn't forced open, it was unlocked. That was the first sign something was off. I knew I had locked it that morning. Inside, drawers were pulled out, cabinets left open, papers thrown everywhere. The coffee table was flipped over, and the couch cushions had been ripped apart. Whoever did this wasn't just looking for valuables. They were searching for something specific. I went straight to the small safe in my bedroom. It was still locked, but the problem was, I hadn't kept the most important documents inside. The copies of the legal paperwork, the ones proving my uncle's claim on the house was fraudulent, were in a folder I had left in my desk. That folder was gone. I stood there staring at the empty spot where it had been. Then I remembered the security cameras. I had a simple setup, just a couple of cameras in the living room and near the front door. I pulled up the footage on my phone and scrolled back to earlier that afternoon. At first, nothing. Then movement. Two figures crept inside, both wearing hoodies pulled low. But one of them, Brian, made a mistake. He adjusted his sleeve, revealing the same watch he had been bragging about at the reunion. My uncle, meanwhile, didn't bother covering his face at all, convinced they wouldn't get caught. I had everything I needed. I zoomed in, double-checking. Even with the hoodie, it was him. Same build, same way he moved. I kept watching. A minute later, another figure stepped inside. My uncle. I had to watch the whole thing to believe it. They tore through my place for nearly 20 minutes, going through everything. When Brian found the folder, he held it up like a prize before stuffing it into his backpack. Then they left. No hesitation, no guilt. They just walked out like they owned the place. I called the police immediately. An officer showed up within the hour, took my statement, and I handed over the footage. They told me they'd investigate, but with clear video evidence, I knew exactly where this was headed. The next call I made was to my lawyer. By the next morning, word had already spread through the family. The ones who had stayed neutral up until this point were now completely against my uncle and Brian. Even the relatives who had defended them before were disgusted. Then came the excuses. My uncle denied everything, acting like Brian must have acted alone. But he had been right there in the footage. There was no talking his way out of this one. Brian, when confronted, had a different excuse. He claimed he was just taking back what was rightfully his. But deep down, I think they both knew they were out of options. My uncle had been convinced his scheme would work for years. He had banked on my dad's reluctance to fight back, on the legal system being slow, on the family siding with him. Now that everything was crumbling, they had no real plan to get out of it. But the worst reaction, my grandmother. She had been upset before, but now she was livid. She called my uncle personally and let him have it. I don't know exactly what was said, but from what I heard, she told him that if he didn't come clean, she would make sure he was completely cut off from the family. It didn't matter, he refused to admit anything, so my lawyer took the next step. The original lawsuit was about property fraud. Now we were adding charges for theft and unlawful entry. A court date was set, but the process dragged on longer than I expected. Property disputes like this weren't resolved overnight. My lawyer told me it could take months, even years, but I was patient. The evidence was airtight, and eventually our hearing was scheduled. Brian's cockiness was gone. When I saw him again, he wouldn't even look me in the eye. My uncle, on the other hand, was still acting like he had everything under control. But he didn't, because now this wasn't just about a house. It was about everything. Word about the lawsuit spread fast. I started getting messages from family members I hadn't spoken to in years, some supporting me, others urging me to just drop it and move on. Apparently, suing family was a bigger crime than them breaking into my house and committing fraud. Then Brian started his little PR stunt. He went on social media, acting like the victim, posting about greedy relatives and how I was suing family over a house I didn't even own. He twisted everything, making it sound like I was taking legal action out of pure spite. The post started circulating among mutual friends and extended family. Some people, mainly his side of the family, ate it up. Then the real shock came. My dad had always been reluctant to stir up conflict, but even he couldn't ignore what had happened. Still, old habits die hard. He called me one evening, clearly torn, saying that maybe we should settle to avoid dragging this through court. But when I pushed back, reminding him of everything my uncle had done, I could hear his hesitation fading. By the time the trial arrived, he finally saw my uncle for what he was, and he stood beside me without question. He was still treating my uncle like he was some misguided relative instead of a man who literally stole from him. I told him straight, I'm not dropping this. That was the last time we talked for a while. Then things got worse. A week before our court date, my lawyer discovered something disturbing. Some of the legal records for the house were missing. Documents that had been publicly available, records of ownership, property agreements, had vanished from the county database. It wasn't an accident. Someone had intentionally removed them. We started digging, then I got an anonymous message. Someone claiming to be a former friend of Brian's reached out, saying Brian had been bragging about having a guy who can fix paperwork. Now it was clear. They weren't just trying to win the case, they were actively covering their tracks, deleting or altering documents to make sure nothing could be used against them. That's when I decided to find out exactly why my uncle was so desperate to keep the house. Turns out, he was drowning in massive debt. Through some financial digging, I found out that my uncle had been making bad investments for years. He owed money left and right, creditors, loans, possibly even shady under-the-table deals. The lake house was his golden ticket, his one chance to sell it off and escape his financial mess. The entire thing, from manipulating the deed to breaking into my apartment, was because he needed fast cash. Brian, who had been acting like this was some petty family dispute, wasn't so smug anymore. The panic started setting in. He went quiet online, stopped posting his usual arrogant takes. Brian held out longer than I expected. Even as the case went forward, he doubled down on his arrogance, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. But then, as the legal fees piled up and more family members turned on him, the desperation crept in. A week before the hearing, I got a message from him. He wanted to talk. Not in public, not through lawyers, privately. He wanted to settle. I ignored it. By then it was too late for them. Then the police got involved. A detective called me. Brian and my uncle were now under official investigation for fraud and burglary. The break-in footage, their attempts to erase records, it all added up, and just like that, the family started turning on them. The ones who had defended them, who had stayed neutral, suddenly didn't want to be associated with them anymore. People who had told me to just move on were now calling my uncle a thief. But it wasn't over yet. The court date arrived. I walked into the courtroom with my lawyer and my dad, who at this point had realized there was no stopping this. Brian and my uncle were already there, looking visibly shaken. Then, their lawyer got up and pulled a desperate move. He claimed that I had fabricated the break-in footage, that the video evidence was fake. I sat there listening to this ridiculous argument, waiting. Then my lawyer stood up. He pulled out the unedited security footage, the police reports, and witness statements. The judge wasn't buying any of their lies. Then my uncle tried one final excuse. He claimed mental distress, that this entire case was causing him suffering and should be dismissed. The judge looked beyond done. This wasn't just a family feud anymore. This was about fraud, breaking and entering, tampering with legal records, and outright theft. And for the first time, my uncle and Brian realized they were losing. The courtroom was packed. Family members, reporters, even a few locals who had heard about the case were seated, waiting for the next move. My uncle sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering something urgently to him. Brian kept shifting in his seat, eyes darting around like he was looking for an escape. Then my grandmother was called to the stand. She walked slowly but steadily, taking her seat in front of the judge. The room was completely silent as she adjusted the microphone and looked directly at my uncle. When she spoke, her voice was clear and firm. She told the court that my grandfather never wanted the house to leave the family, that he had spoken about it countless times. The lake house was meant to be passed down, not sold, not stolen. Brian, who had been quiet up until this point, suddenly spoke up, cutting her off. He called her confused, saying she was too old to remember things correctly. The entire courtroom gasped. The judge's gavel slammed down hard. He turned to Brian and warned him that if he interrupted again, he would be held in contempt of court. Brian shut his mouth, but his leg bounced rapidly under the table. Then came the real bombshell. My lawyer stood up and presented a new set of documents. They had been recovered from the county archives, the original property records before my uncle had tampered with them. These documents showed clear evidence of signature forgery. My uncle had faked my father's approval on the transfer papers. The judge turned to my uncle and demanded an explanation. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His lawyer scrambled, flipping through papers, trying to find something, anything, to counter the evidence, but there was nothing. The tension in the room was suffocating. Then the judge spoke. He announced that, based on the new evidence, formal fraud charges would be filed against my uncle and Brian. Brian let out a shaky breath. Then his entire face crumpled. He put his head in his hands and started crying. My dad, who had spent most of the case in silence, looked completely crushed. He turned to me, his voice barely above a whisper, and told me I had done the right thing. Then the ruling was made. The judge officially voided my uncle's claim on the lake house. The courtroom exploded into chaos. My uncle shot to his feet, shouting something about unfair treatment. Brian stood up like he was about to walk out, but before he could take another step, a security officer blocked his path. Then something none of us expected happened. The judge looked at my uncle, then at the bailiffs. He ordered them to arrest my uncle on the spot. The entire room froze as two officers moved toward him. He started backing up, waving his hands, shaking his head. Then he tried to turn and leave, but one of the officers grabbed his wrist and pulled out handcuffs. He shouted something about being set up, that this was all a misunderstanding, but no one was listening. Brian, standing just a few feet away, looked like he was about to pass out. He wasn't arrested, not yet, but the civil case against him for breaking into my apartment and stealing my documents was still pending. His lawyer had already been informed that they were moving forward with the charges. As my uncle was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his wife sat frozen in the back row. Then, without a word, she picked up her bag and walked out. Later that day, I found out she had filed for divorce. She claimed she had no idea about his shady dealings and wanted nothing to do with him. That night, Brian went online and posted a long dramatic rant about how family should never do this to each other. He made himself out to be the victim, painting me as some cold-hearted relative who had betrayed his own blood over a house. It didn't work. Even his closest friends weren't backing him up anymore. Comments flooded in calling him out for his lies, telling him he had brought this on himself. Within hours, he deleted the post. But despite everything, I wasn't done yet. Brian had broken into my home, stolen from me, and thought he could get away with it. I wasn't dropping the lawsuit. This wasn't over. The fallout happened fast. My uncle, after a few days in lockup, finally cracked. He pleaded guilty to fraud in exchange for a lighter sentence. He had no choice. The evidence was airtight. The forged documents, the break-in footage, the witness testimonies, it was all stacked against him. His lawyer probably convinced him that dragging this out any longer would only make things worse. With the guilty plea, the legal system took over. He was ordered to pay massive fines, along with full restitution for the money he had tried to steal. On top of that, he was hit with a permanent fraud conviction. That meant he wouldn't just walk away from this. His reputation, his financial standing, everything he had built over the years, gone. Meanwhile, Brian was spiraling. His civil lawsuit was still ongoing, and instead of keeping his head down, he did what he always did, played the victim. He went on a long dramatic rant online, blaming me for ruining his life. According to him, I had blown everything out of proportion and had dragged our family's name through the mud over a stupid vacation home. It backfired. Even his closest friends started distancing themselves. Some left comments telling him he had brought this on himself. Others simply stopped replying to him altogether. I started hearing from mutual connections that Brian was losing everyone. The same people who used to laugh at his arrogant jokes now wanted nothing to do with him. Then, he called me. His voice was shaky. He didn't try to sound cocky this time. He was begging. He told me he had nothing left, that his life was falling apart, that this lawsuit was going to ruin him. He wanted me to just drop everything, let him move on. I hung up without a word. The lake house was finally back in the right hands. My dad and I officially reclaimed it, with all the legal paperwork finalized. The battle was over. A few days later, my grandmother visited the lake house one last time. She walked through the room slowly, running her fingers along the old wooden walls, looking out over the lake where she and my grandfather had spent so many summers. She cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. Brian, meanwhile, hit rock bottom. His apartment lease ended, and with no stable income, he couldn't afford rent. He tried to move back in with his mom, but she refused to take him in. Eventually, he was forced to crash on a friend's couch, bouncing from one place to another. Then my uncle lost everything. After paying his legal fees, fines, and restitution, he had nothing left. The house he had been living in, the one he had bought with his smart investments, had to be sold. He tried to spin the situation like it was a fresh start, but everyone knew the truth. He had destroyed his own life. The family was permanently divided. Some relatives, especially those on my uncle's side, blamed me for tearing the family apart. They acted like I was the villain, the one who had gone too far. But others, the ones who actually understood what had happened, told me I had done the right thing. Then, Brian pulled his final stunt. One afternoon, I was at the lake house when I saw a car pulling up the driveway. Brian stepped out. He looked rough. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair a mess, bags under his eyes. He had the nerve to act like he belonged there, walking toward the house like nothing had happened. I didn't even let him get close. I called the cops immediately, and within minutes an officer arrived. Brian was officially trespassed from the property. His reaction? He went back online and posted another rant. One last, bitter attempt to get people on his side. He talked about how unfair everything was, how he had been betrayed by his own blood, how I had turned the whole family against him. Nobody took his side. At this point, his reputation was beyond saving. The post barely got any engagement, and the few people who did comment mocked him. It didn't take long for him to delete it entirely. Then, something unexpected happened. My story gained traction on Reddit. Someone had shared the entire saga on one of the popular subreddits, and it blew up. Thousands of people were talking about it, offering support, laughing at Brian's downfall. Some even dug up his old social media posts, pointing out how arrogant he had been before everything collapsed. For the first time in months, I felt peace. The lake house was finally safe. My dad and I started making renovations, fixing up the parts of the house that had been neglected over the years. The place would now stay in the family, forever. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the water, my dad finally spoke. He said he was proud of me. We had won, completely. A thick envelope arrived at my doorstep. No return address. I already knew who it was from before I even opened it. Inside was a lawsuit notice. Brian was trying to countersue me for emotional distress. He claimed that my legal actions had humiliated him publicly and caused him irreparable damage. I didn't even have to read past the first few paragraphs before forwarding it to my lawyer. The response was immediate. The case was laughable. Brian had no legal grounds for this. No evidence, no actual claim, just a desperate attempt to grab money. My lawyer told me outright that if this went to court, Brian would be the one paying me in the end. Word spread fast. Even the few family members who had previously supported Brian were now done with him. They had stuck by him through everything. The fraud, the lies, the break-in, but suing me over his own stupidity. That was the breaking point. Then, Brian's own lawyer backed out. He must have realized Brian had no way to pay him. Without a lawyer, Brian was left scrambling. The lawsuit was doomed before it even started. That's when he pulled his next pathetic move. A GoFundMe popped up under his name. The title, "Help Me Rebuild My Life After Family Betrayal." The description was even worse. He spun this long sob story about how I had ruined his future, stolen everything from him, and left him with nowhere to go. It didn't work. In 2 weeks, he raised $12. Then, one of my cousins screenshot the GoFundMe and dropped it in the family group chat. The chat exploded with laughter. Any last shred of respect Brian had left in the family was gone. Then came the next hit. My uncle officially filed for bankruptcy. After everything, the court battles, the fines, the legal fees, he had nothing left. He tried to put on a brave face, talking about how this was just a temporary setback, but everyone knew the truth. He had lost. Completely. Then Brian's girlfriend dumped him. One of my cousins reached out with an update. Brian's longtime girlfriend had finally had enough. She packed up her things and left, telling people she couldn't deal with his drama anymore. Apparently, she had been supporting him financially for months, covering his rent, his bills, even his gas money. The second she left, Brian was screwed. Then his job fired him. A friend of mine reached out and told me Brian's employer found out about the break-in case. It didn't take long for them to decide they didn't want to be associated with him. With no job, no girlfriend, no savings, and no backup plan, Brian was officially at rock bottom. Then, he tried one last time. A text popped up on my phone, a long, desperate message from Brian. He rambled about how things had gone too far, how he never meant for this to happen, how he just wanted to fix things. He threw in some guilt tripping, saying he had lost everything and that I was the only family he had left. I didn't reply. Then finally my dad admitted the truth. After months of hesitation, after wavering back and forth, he finally admitted that Brian and my uncle had always been selfish. He told me that, looking back, he should have stood up to his brother sooner. It didn't change what happened, but it meant something. Then Brian pulled his last pathetic trick. I got a notification. Brian had tagged me in a Facebook post. The post was some dramatic nonsense about wanting to make peace and forgiving the past. It was so fake that it was almost funny. I blocked him immediately. Then he tried something even dumber. He started rebranding himself online, posting vague inspirational quotes, talking about how he had grown from his past mistakes and was focusing on becoming a better person. No one believed it. The comments were brutal, people calling him out, reminding him of everything he had done. Eventually, he disabled replies altogether. Meanwhile, the lake house was finally safe. My dad and I finalized the last of the paperwork, ensuring that it could never be taken from us again. The nightmare was finally over. Then I made the last move. I blocked my uncle. I blocked Brian. I cut them out of my life completely. They were nothing to me now. A year had passed since everything went down. For the first time in a long time, the lake house felt like home again. No legal battles, no stress, just peace. That summer, my dad and I hosted a family gathering at the lake house. Only the people who truly mattered showed up. Laughter echoed across the water as kids played in the lake, while the adults sat around the fire, swapping stories. No drama, no fights, just a family that had finally healed from the chaos. Brian and my uncle were nowhere to be seen. Word got around that Brian was couch surfing. A mutual acquaintance mentioned that Brian had bounced between friends' places for months, struggling to hold down a job. His credit was ruined, his reputation destroyed, and no one wanted to deal with him. My uncle, meanwhile, vanished. He sold off the last of his assets and moved to a distant town, cutting off contact with nearly everyone. He left behind a trail of debts and burnt bridges. No one knew exactly where he ended up, and honestly, no one cared. That fall, my grandmother visited the lake house again. She walked through the rooms, smiling as she took in every detail. It was like she could finally breathe again, knowing that the house was still in the family. She sat by the lake for hours, watching the sunset. Then Brian tried to worm his way back into the family. He started reaching out to relatives, ones he hadn't spoken to in years. He suddenly wanted to reconnect, talking about forgiveness and letting go of the past. It didn't work. Most of the family wanted nothing to do with him. After everything he had pulled, the lies, the manipulation, the theft, no one was interested in giving him a second chance. Then he emailed me. It was the same predictable nonsense. He had changed. He wanted to talk. He wanted to fix things. I ignored it. At the next big family gathering, everyone agreed. Brian and my uncle were officially out. They weren't welcome at reunions, holidays, or any family events. Even my dad, who had once been hesitant to cut ties, stood by my side completely. He even went so far as to offer to pay back some of my legal fees. He admitted that I had been right all along. Then, karma hit Brian again. He got caught stealing from another job. The company fired him immediately, and word got around that he was now blacklisted in his industry. No one wanted to hire him. Desperate for attention, he ran back to social media. He posted a long, dramatic rant about being betrayed by his own blood. He tried to play the victim again. The comments roasted him mercilessly. People brought up the break-in, the fraud, his failed GoFundMe. No one had forgotten what he had done. Then he pulled his most pathetic move yet. He started a YouTube channel. His angle? Becoming a life coach. He made videos about overcoming adversity, learning from mistakes, and rebuilding your life. It flopped. The channel barely got any views. The few comments were people laughing at him, calling him out for trying to give advice when his own life was a disaster. Then I found out something ironic. Brian had tried to rent a place near the lake house. He had wanted to move closer, maybe thinking he could run into me, guilt trip me in person. His credit was too bad. He couldn't get approved. Meanwhile, the family's new tradition was thriving. Every summer, my dad and I hosted a big gathering at the lake house. The people who actually mattered showed up, and Brian and my uncle were never invited. Then Brian made one last pathetic attempt. A letter arrived in my mailbox. From him. I didn't even open it. I shredded it and threw it away. That evening, I sat by the lake, watching the water ripple under the setting sun. The house was safe. My family was intact. Brian was completely irrelevant. Months passed, and Brian disappeared. No social media posts, no desperate emails, no pathetic attempts to make peace. Silence. At first, I figured he had finally given up. Maybe he had found some other poor soul to manipulate, or maybe he had moved far away. Either way, I didn't care. He was out of my life. Then, one day, my phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. It was Brian's mother. She sounded exhausted, defeated. She said she wouldn't normally reach out, but Brian was in bad shape. He had burned every bridge, had nowhere left to go. He was living in a rundown motel, completely broke. The friends he had relied on had finally gotten sick of him. He had tried asking family for help, but no one was answering his calls. She didn't ask me for money. She just wanted to know if there was anything I could do. I told her the truth. Brian made his choices. Then I hung up. Later, I found out he had tried reaching out to our grandmother. She refused to help him. After everything he had done, stealing from the family, breaking into my house, lying to everyone, he thought she would still give him money. She shut him down immediately. Brian was running out of options. That's when he tried one last desperate move. He contacted my lawyer. He wanted to settle things peacefully. No details, no specifics, just an offer to fix everything if I was willing to talk. I didn't even respond. Then he tried to make himself the victim. He reached out to a local news station, pitching his story. Some nonsense about how his own family had abandoned him and ruined his life. He probably thought someone would take pity on him. The station didn't even acknowledge him. By now, the entire family was done. At the next gathering, a decision was made. Brian and my uncle were officially cut off permanently. No more discussions, no second chances. They weren't invited to any reunions, weddings, or holidays. As far as we were concerned, they didn't exist. Then the most hilarious thing happened. One of my cousins called me, barely able to contain their laughter. Brian had gotten a job at a gas station, not just any gas station, the one near the lake house. I almost didn't believe it. But then, a cousin sent me a text, barely able to contain their laughter. "You won't believe this. Brian got a job at the gas station near the lake house." I didn't even need to see it myself to know it was true. The irony was just too perfect. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I took my time walking up. Then he looked up. His face paled. For a second, it seemed like he wanted to say something. Maybe apologize, maybe try to spin another lie. But he didn't. Instead, he awkwardly avoided eye contact, scanning my items in silence. As I turned to leave, he muttered, "I hope you're happy." I just smiled and walked away. That was the moment I realized Brian wasn't worth my anger anymore. A few days later, he had one last meltdown. He made a long, angry post on Facebook, ranting about how I was heartless and how family should always forgive and forget. He threw out every excuse possible, blaming his mistakes on stress, on bad influences, on misunderstandings. It didn't work. No one cared. Then, the final laugh, I found out his fake life coaching business had completely failed. The website was gone. The YouTube channel was abandoned. He owed thousands in debt from trying to run a business with no experience, no money, and no credibility. I sat on the lake house porch that evening, watching the sunset. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Brian and my uncle were gone from my life forever. Justice was served.